Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Drum roll. For domestic terrorism, I am optimistic for after November 3rd. And I want to get into that a little bit more using a case study that has obviously been on people's minds. But my view on, and this is an area where I specialize in, and I'm talking here about mass instability, mass violence, I'm fairly optimistic that we're not going to have the worst case or even the near worst case that a lot of people are talking about after November 3rd. And it gets into this, for months now, I've been describing this difference between the threat from clandestine terror groups and what you might call the next step on the food chain is insurgencies. And the clandestine terror is these are small networks of individuals who they have to hide from the population as much as they have to hide from the authorities. And the difference of that between an insurgency or, an insurgency, people like, well, we don't have insurgency here. And yes, I'd argue we have, both in the Civil War and the Revolutionary War, and even after that, we've had insurgencies. But the difference than insurgencies, an insurgency has enough popular support that the insurgents don't have to hide from the population to the same extent they have to hide from the authorities. And I go into a lot of forecasts. In the 2020 Ask Me Anything, I went into a lot of forecasts about instability and what gives rise to instability and violence, mass violence. And, there's all these factors, but I want to talk today about this and use a case study. What's the difference? What's the threshold between terror groups have to remain clandestine and they can act as an insurgent? As a rule of thumb, I say about 17%. Which means if you picked 100 people randomly within the population and you told 100 people that there was a group over there making bombs and they're going to bomb something, bomb a church, bomb a mosque, or do a shoot up a Walmart or anything like that, they found out that there was a group planning a mass violent event. If 17 people out of 100 won't turn that group into the authorities, they hear about it and either because they're scared, they're intimidated, or they support that group, whatever that reason is, if 17 out of 100 people, now you have conditions that are ripe for an insurgency. Because an insurgent, clandestine terror has to spend an enormous amount of time to hide from the authorities and the rest of the population. If you're an insurgent, you really just need to hide from the authorities. And we saw this in Iraq and Afghanistan all the time. You don't need to hide. I mean, the people in the area kind of know who the insurgents are, but they're either intimidated enough. And that threshold, it's a holistic number. This isn't like a heavily researched one, but I guess it's around 17%, 17 people out of 100. Below that threshold, you're probably still in the area where you're talking about small clandestine terror groups. Now, they can still cause harm, but when it comes to mass violence and mass instability, they're not, they're doing pinpricks as opposed to widespread devastation. And this example here, of the militia plot, the domestic terror plot to kidnap the Michigan governor, is a good case study to walk through as to where the threat I see post November 3rd. I don't see, and I'm going to go through my election forecast here in the last bit that people are interested on what my forecast is, but I don't see the same kind of risk after the election that there's going to be a civil war, or we're going to see IED bombs everywhere and the kind of campaigns and things like that. It's going to continue to be these sort of isolated shooting events with one or two participants. Now, they may seem fairly frequent because they're coming up on social media a lot, but we're talking the Kenosha shooting, 2 or 3 people killed, one's arrested. You have the Portland shooting, 1 person killed, 1 person then killed in an attempt to apprehend them. The details of that I'm not going to get into because I don't do forensic scene analysis, but those are pinpoint interactions as opposed to, by way of comparison, I was reading the other day, the FBI was investigating something like 1,800 bombings a year during the height of the violence associated with the civil rights movement, right? So I just want to think about 1,800 bombings a year at a population that's half the size it is now. The level of difference in violence is just, it's hard to fathom, and we can use charts and visualizations, but it's just hard for us to get our heads around how much less violent we are now than we were 30 or 40 years ago. And yeah, we may have a spike up, but that spike up is only taking us back to 2008, 2007, 2006, not times that people think back and say, wow, that was much like a civil war. No, it's moderately more violent. But this case in Michigan is interesting because it's the exact kind of group on the timeline that I've described, and I'm using the Department of Justice criminal complaint. There's a link to it in the below. And so I want to be clear, this is the government side of the story. We haven't heard their side of the story. I'll declare my bias up front. I'm not really favorable to the people who are alleged to have conspired to kidnap and kill a sitting governor, but to declare the bias, we are only hearing the government side of the story. But what they lay out is the exact scenario that I fear from clandestine terror groups and on the timeline. So they actually get on the radar. This is interesting. They get on the radar in March of 2020, even before the lockdowns, even before the huge controversies of, in Michigan, where they stormed the state house and kind of, demanded an end to the lockdown in April, before Trump said liberate. These folks were already on the radar, and they emerged from the Second Amendment groups. I mean, this is not the only path of emergent. There's a lot of acceleration pathways in the US right now. You could talk white supremacy, Second Amendment groups, things like that, and other ones as well. But this one comes from Second Amendment groups. They're big on gun rights. And what they do is they begin discussing in March of 2020, and this is when they get brought to the awareness of the FBI. Now, what happens is as the lockdowns begin, this group, it's only about 8 people. They are not really, they're part of this constellation of groups and social media connections and things like that are in this kind of general area, but they're not part of a 500-person militia or a large organized militia. One of the things that's really interesting, when you look at lone wolf events, you often find that they get rejected by the larger groups, because the larger groups kind of know which side of the bread their butter's on. They know how far they can push the status quo while also still getting money for t-shirts, caps, Facebook advertising. Maybe they got a Patreon too, or they're doing OnlyFans. I'm not going to judge. But these large groups, they're generally money-making machines, and they realize if they run afoul of the FBI, they're going to stop making money. So they actually have a limiting effect. It's obviously tenuous, and you got things like Charlottesville where it all blows up. But generally speaking, the lone wolf actors are ones who get rejected from the main groups and then go off and form these small groups. This is a small group, 6 to 8 people. And what happens is in June, between March and June, they begin shifting from this kind of general, they're going to come take our guns, paranoia concern, to really accelerating on the coronavirus, the lockdowns, and the mask. And they begin focusing, they go from being, they were going to target police stations, they were looking at targeting government facilities, to they really begin focusing on Governor Whitmer, excuse me. And they have all these sort of pseudo commando fantasies. They've got these operational measures, like every time they have a meeting, they make them put their cell phones upstairs, and then they go down and they have anti-surveillance. This is one of the characteristics you see with these clandestine groups, is they tend to have this pseudo commando fantasy where they're imagining what the operators do. Virtually no clue, but they're basically imitating what they think they see on TV, like don't turn your cell phone off because we don't want to be traced. Well, what they didn't realize, and is so often the case, the FBI was onto these folks way before they even thought about putting their cell phones, and they had, of the 8 people, 2 of them were FBI informants. So you talk about that threshold of like hiding out. Of the 8 people that were in this group, 2 of them were FBI informants, and they didn't know about each other. These are like 2 people who were independently went to the FBI and said, yeah, I'm really not comfortable with this going on right now, and became informants. So even as they're doing the, putting their cell phone in the tinfoil wrapper and leaving it in the box, they have people who are basically wired by the FBI recording all these conversations. So we have a really good record of how this unfolds, and it's fascinating if you want to read it. But just at a high level, beginning in mid-June, they're focused more and more on the lockdowns, and they're focusing on Governor Whitmer. They do these training exercises. July through August is when they're doing trainings. They throw in all the military words like FTX, which is a field training exercise. They're doing all sorts of commando operator type stuff. They're doing reconnaissance. They're kind of amateurs about it. They're talking openly about kidnapping and killing a governor. This is an open conversation. But then they think they're going to be sly when they're on the phone by using code phrases like, baker and cake. They're clearly referring to explosives there. They're trying to find someone who can create a bomb, that they can use a bomb. And it's kind of like almost out of a movie. It's like, have you been able to contact the baker to buy the cake? They've just been talking about kidnapping the governor, and now they're going to talk about like birthday cake. This isn't, these code words are not very sophisticated. If I wanted to, I'm not doing that for any NSA listening in. If I'm going to be planning something nefarious, my code words are going to be like IEP or tax audit or standardized testing debate or something to do with Doctor Who. Any of those things that gets everyone to turn off and tune out and not pay attention anymore. That's what I'm going to pick to my code words. If I start using slide terms like, have you hired the baker to get the cake? It feels to me like they're wanting to get caught. And one of the things I talk about is, failure notoriety. I'm not saying these guys aren't dangerous. They went ahead and they couldn't get people to make IEDs, so they started creating a very crude IEDs using fireworks and shrapnel and pennies and stuff like that. They did reconnaissance on the governor's vacation manager. They did a reconnaissance during the day. They did a reconnaissance at night. They were operational. They were planning an attack before the November 3rd elections, and this is very well documented. This is not that it's not that they're dangerous, but they're so amateur about it. And this is the difference of the threat. This is, I mean, if you think about it, that 17% threshold, 20%, 25% of their own people turn them in to the FBI. And when it comes to, mass insurgencies and stuff like that, this is something that needs to be known. And I'll get into a little bit when we get to the asymmetric communication, if we get into that bit, about what we can do with this information. But these are the kind of groups that scare me, because yeah, they can be amateur. They can afford to be wrong every time they do it but once. And it's that one time that actually causes an attack, causes an incident, causes someone to get hurt. And the FBI can't catch them all. So this is the concern I have, is not large groups rising up in the cities and having mass instability, but small, semi-functional, barely competent, getting lucky. Charles is asking, isn't that how most criminals get caught? They are dumb. I have a comment about the president of the United States, but I'm just going to leave it at that. Yeah, most criminals do get caught because they're dumb. Most people, and that's the thing is, when I go through the forecast, most Americans are not willing to spend time in jail for their beliefs yet. And that is a great suppressant on getting them out there and doing things which would get them caught. And that is not, I'm not saying they're ideological pure. I mean, we can see the survey polls, you can draw your own conclusions. There's a lot of nasty thoughts, but most people tend to like not being in jail more than they want to pursue whatever ideological thing they're saying they're really, yes. Ed's mentioning just do all your code words of HIPAA, then your completion conversation is wrong, they can't use it. So yeah, this is the kind of, so I'm optimistic, actually. I don't see, and this has to do with my election forecast, which I'm going to get into, is I don't see a huge risk of mass instability and violence after the election. I know everyone's concerned about civil wars or even insurgencies or things like that. I'm not seeing it. First of all, it's the winter, right? It's fall, winter. It's not comfortable outside. And second, the groups we're seeing are these small clandestine groups. Now, I said it would be 6 to 18 months that these groups would take to form, plan, operationalize. We're going to see. And here is an example of a group that is, from March of last year to October when they're caught, 8 months. And, you're going to see more of these. So we got to be prepared and still stay vigilant. But this is the risk coming up in at least the next 6 months, I think, is this kind of risk. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.